Good afternoon from Turin, and so I'm not sure what time of day it is where you are, but hello to everyone, and it's so good to have you join us. So this is the first of the YSI IUC Web-Seminar series for 2021, and so we're particularly excited to welcome you. Just to give you a bit of context on the Web-Seminar series, it is a collaboration between two organizations. So the one being YSI, the Young Scholars Initiative, which is part of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And YSI is a global community of about 12,000 researchers, young professionals, and students, a global community, and so distributed all across the world, basically pursuing new ways of thinking about the economy. And the IUC, which we'll hear a little bit from the director of the IUC, Professor Giuseppe Mastruzzo, is an institution based in Turin, which is also pursuing critical ways of thinking of law, economics, and finance. And so a collaboration between these two institutions was inevitable. And we have a number of beloved IUC alumni who are part of YSI. And so we've been working quite closely collaborating with these two institutions. In 2019, we had the first YSI IUC webinar series, which was started by Alexander Stoyanovich, and with the hope that over the next years, we would then pass it on to each master's class at the IUC, and so that it can become a long-term collaboration between these two institutions. And so we're very excited to be able to continue it this year. We weren't able to do it last year because of the pandemic, but we hope that in the next years, we'll be able to continue with this webinar series. And so I'll hand over now to Professor Mastruzzo, who will give a word about the IUC as well as the CLEF Masters. Thank you, Prof.
It'll be a single word. But first of all, let me greet Nidhi Srinivas, who's a friend also, not only a professor from New York, from one of the most prestigious institutions, international institutions, the New School for Social Sciences. We started this collaboration between the International University College and INET because of Tom Ferguson, who is a director at the INET in New York, and it is a regular contributor to the IUC faculty since time immemorial. To be more into memory, we started 13 years ago our academic activities. We've had in our program, it is an LLM in comparative law, economics, and finance, students from 77 countries in the world, mostly from the global south. We are selecting at this very moment. So if you have brilliant friends, not even young friends, with a vivid, critical intelligence and even imagination, please let them know and let them apply. The IUC is, as Christina, who's one of our best products, the IUC is a community which wants to interact with the world, which wants to change the world, which wants to prepare young people to make a future for their future generations. I'm too old to have other generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mastruzzo, and you're never too old. Your contribution is definitely appreciated for our generation. And so thank you, Professor Mastruzzo. And so now I'll hand over to Anya Vujovic. I've been trying so hard to get it. And she'll be the moderator for this session. And so I'll hand over to her and Professor Nidhi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. And that was a brilliant pronunciation. So my name is Anya Vujovic, and I'm currently attending a Law, Economics, and Finance Master's program at the IUC. So Professor Mastruzzo has already announced our speaker today, but I will continue. I will build upon his story. So today we'll hear Professor Nidhi Srinivas, who is an associate professor of management at the Milano School of Policy, Management, and Environment. So he has many research topics and interests, but however, most notable one has been related to organizational studies, as well as social innovation, engagement, post-colonial studies, and history, and many other topics. So in addition to the Milano School of Policy, he also taught in Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo, Sao Paulo School of Business Administration in Brazil, as well as the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore and Turin as well. So he's a professional with a very wide portfolio and very, I mean, for me, but also I believe for people who are not in the field, very interesting topics and publications. So today, as all of you may know, he will discuss mutual aid, focusing on the pandemic framework and pandemic implications. So I will be short and let him proceed. Thank you, Professor.
Anya, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And Giuseppe, thank you very much for your kind introduction as well. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I've met Giuseppe informally before, and each time I'm reminded of the vibrant community that is the IUC, and I'm delighted also to know more about the YSI. My presentation today is going to be a little unusual. And I want to warn you before I start that I studied in a business school, but my own interests are very much to the left in terms of my politics and my own research. In terms of my politics, I would say I would characterize myself as an anarcho-syndicalist with socialist sympathies, if that means anything. In terms of my research, it is very much an engagement with critical theory. So it does beg the question why I studied in a business school, but that's something I've never been able to work out. And so the critical energy I offer at best is that of engaging with a professional discourse that tries to train people to manage capitalist organizations. And I try to complexify that and raise questions that ideally will help us create a more compassionate capitalist world. I said ideally, but we'll have to see. I'll now turn to my slides and continue. I'm going to assume you're able to see these slides, and in case you're not, I request someone to let me know. So would you? You can see them. Wonderful. I'm very, very relieved, Anya. Thank you for letting me know. In front of you, you're looking at a rather terrifying spectacle. This is a demon with something like 8, possibly 9 heads. And there are 2 people on the right-hand side who are looking at this demon. I'm going to name this demon. It's called the coronavirus pandemic, or the COVID-19 pandemic. And I would like you to note that it has many heads. Some are scarier than others. And I'd like you to also note that the 2 people looking at it can't work out what to make of it. And I'd like you to reflect for a moment on the metaphorical weight of such an image. I study questions of management development with focus on the commons and on inequality. As I already mentioned, my theoretical engagement is what some would call as critical theory. And my field research has been in a variety of places, including in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Brazil is a country I deeply love, and I do hope, as Georgina mentioned earlier, that we'll have some opportunity to compare and take notes on similarities between Brazil and India at the moment. More recently, though, I began research on mutual aid groups in New York City, Hyderabad, and Torino, and this was a consequence really of the coronavirus pandemic. I found I was incarcerated, if you will, voluntarily within an apartment in New York City. And I was forced to reflect on the research I was doing, and I was also completing a book on that research. And I felt mutual aid offered me an interesting place to take some of my research forward. As these slides will indicate, I have a lot of interest in photography and art and in literature and travel. Some of the slides you're seeing here, including photographs, are actually ones I've taken, including from Hyderabad, which is a city I originate from, and which also is a city I'm going to be researching. So I'm going to actually talk about mutual aid through 4, if you wish, themes. I'm going to begin by reflecting on something in sociology we typically call a structure and agency, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. I'll then define what mutual aid means historically. I'll very briefly and frankly in a superficial manner showcase 3 very different cities. Hyderabad, which is one of the large cities in southern India, Astoria, which is a suburb, if you wish, of Queens, that is a suburb of New York City, and Torino, which, as you all know, is a large city in the northern part of Italy. And then in my concluding remarks, I'd actually like to reflect a little bit on 2, it might seem really discordant themes. One is on capitalism and management and how we can understand these 2 very large terms. And the second is on hope and despair, or if you wish, how to make sense of the current world we live in philosophical terms. On the right-hand side, you see an image from one of the Mughal miniatures of the 14th century. I believe it doesn't need to be explained too closely. All I do wish to say is that we have all been witnesses in the last year and a half to loss. And part of the question is, how do we grieve and when do we stop grieving? Well, one way to consider the present is to say to us, how do we theorize the pandemic? More specifically, do we theorize the pandemic in terms of something that's within our control? Let's say we were to argue that it is not in our control. Then it simply becomes a question of really saying to ourselves that we really don't have a possibility to intervene, and we really have to just think of a way to be despairing. Let's say, on the other hand, we were to say there is a possibility to intervene, that human beings do have a way to sort of control what's going on in this pandemic. Then we could argue that there is a matter of hope, and that hope involves an intervention. I'd like to argue that a lot of the discussion of the pandemic over the last year and a half, especially theoretically, has been really from a position of pessimism. In short, a position of despair, where we really feel that there's not much any of us can do, and that the impetus to intervene is quite modest. Let me give you some quick examples of what I would call as a kind of a theorizing of despair. Consider the government lockdowns across the world, including in Italy, India, and in the United States, and how distrusting and frustrating those lockdowns have, the kinds of emotions they've generated. Consider the frustration of fumbling, disunited responses, including within the European Union and certainly across the globe. And also consider demagogic, inconsistent actions, notably in countries like India and Brazil, both of which are currently cursed with extraordinarily ineffective leaders. It's also the case that we're in a world right now of dubious information, of falsehoods that masquerade as facts, and these shape a landscape where agency at times, even if it exists, appears to be firmly antisocial. In short, an individualistic suspicion of established authorities. To give you just one of many examples, in the United States, there are people who show agency, they take action, but the action they're really taking is to protect themselves from the state. Anti-vaxxers across parts of Europe, again, distrust the state, and they are taking agency, but it's a kind of an individualism. It's not an agency where they're even mobilizing as a community. So one could argue that this kind of pessimism gestures towards hopelessness and further fear, and removes the notion of agency from discussion entirely. Now, one way to understand this is to look at it from a sociological lens. And I'm going to argue that a structural focus on the pandemic, which is, I would say, the dominant view right now, is a structural focus that converges in a variety of ways. From the left, for instance, if you follow Marx's labor theory of value, as some theorists do, for instance, David McNally and Jeffrey Tyner, you could argue that neoliberal policy commitments have reached the point where labor can no longer take care of itself. In short, labor is forced to rely on home-based networks, rural networks of care. And what this essentially means is that the state is evacuated from meaning. In the meantime, rumors and fears have a long history within anthropology. If you look at the Komarovs, you look at Louisa White, and certainly at Dresner, you'll find there's a long history of the use of storytelling, and especially the use of rumors, to create folk interpretations. So for instance, you may remember the rumor about the radio masts that would allow 5G signals to somehow create the coronavirus. This obviously is untrue, but one way to understand that rumor is that it was the folk response initially to the pandemic and to the fears it conveyed, especially fears of China. So another way to understand the pandemic, which is also structuralist, is to say that the pandemic generates, if you wish, cultural responses that are beyond individual understanding. The people who are casualties of all of the exposures through the pandemic can also be characterized, if you wish, as unpeople. And I'm here using a phrase that, if you wish, is the creative use of Akile Mbembe's notion of the coronavirus leading to a necropopulation. The unpeople are those who must make an effort to live, but they have to really persuade others that they deserve to live. Think, for instance, of undocumented labor across Europe. Think of rural migrants in my country of origin, India, who have had to flee across India every time a lockdown is announced in the urban areas. Think of the people in Brazil, especially in Manaus, who were declared to be miraculously free of the coronavirus and then started to die hopelessly of the virus. And at some point, politicians, including the leader of Brazil, said, people will die, thus implying some people just can't really be bothered to be made, we can't make the effort to ensure they survive. The worst affected are usually the most disposable. In short, labor power is least in their direct control, whether they're the migrant labor in India or in Europe, frontline workers in the United States. And the status of this kind of disposable labor overlaps considerably with racial, class, and gender inequalities. Now, we are at a moment of a hiatus. One could argue the pandemic is behind us, and I'm not going to argue in this presentation that the pandemic is not behind us. I think that's a realm of speculation either way, and it doesn't interest me. But at the moment, parts of the world are still battling the pandemic. At the moment, though, Europe seems to be releasing some of its restrictions. European leaders are aware that they have to monitor the situation closely, and that is, of course, still the case in Canada and the United States, and certainly in Oceania. In such a situation, it's reasonable to expect that there will continue to be questioning of the origins of the virus, of its causes, of what makes it spread, controversies on how to reduce its spread, and that there will be constantly discussion and debates on key aspects of politics and identity, for instance, about freedom, race, and religion. I'd like to argue that in such a situation, the coronavirus can be actually seen as a template for what Agamben has called about as a state of emergency. I'd also like to say it will remain a template for what Mbembe calls as necropopulations. Some examples of necropopulations that you'll see on this slide. If you look in the middle of it, New York State, the state I live in right now in the United States, actually sued Amazon, the mega corporation, for inadequately protecting its workers. If you wish, it's an indication of the extent corporations are now forced to actually acknowledge that their frontline employees are important enough to be protected. One way to understand this is through Agamben, who the Italian political philosopher, extraordinary philosopher, Giorgio Agamben, who at one point argued that there are two ways in which we can characterize human beings. One is that human beings are immersed in the fact of living, what he characterizes using ancient Greek as zoe. And the other, as human beings have a political life, bios. To put it very bluntly and crudely, you could argue that undocumented migrants across Europe, including Italy and Greece at the moment, are immersed in zoe, but they lack a bios. They do not have a political life. By definition, they don't because they're not documented, so they can't, I believe, vote. But they are immersed very much in the fact of living. Agamben calls this as a bare life. It's a bare life because you are living, but you're not protected in your life. And your life doesn't have a political meaning, which means it cannot really be justified as something that deserves protection. That has a great weight when you think of the virus and the way it spreads. Communities that can be protected will be, but those that cannot be will experience the bare life further. In such a situation, there is one form of agency that I find fascinating, and that is mutual aid. And I'm now going to turn from these rather scattered reflections on the coronavirus to tell you how, if you wish, mutual aid is a response to what Agamben would call a bare life. And in doing this, I hope you understand, I'm not interested in painting mutual aid as a savior, but I'm interested in the fact that it is becoming spoken of more and more often, and I'm intrigued by that fact. So if you look at the moment, these slides on the right, I'm going to skip through them really fast, but I'll just briefly summarize them. These are some indications of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on people globally. The slide on the top, for instance, shows you the levels of income of the millionaires in the world at the moment. And you'll find that they're all doing incredibly well, and they've done extremely well over the last year. The second slide on the right shows you the fall in living standards, and at the bottom you'll see that workers with less education and who are younger have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. There is a danger when we look at all of this of being deterministic. And there's a danger that we think of these people, including the ones we're sympathetic to, as being what we could call as judgmental dopes, that is lacking agency. I want to spend a very brief moment, and this is sort of outside my slide, to tell you what I mean by agency, because I recognize that that word may not have a lot of meaning for people outside sociological training. Sociologists talk about structure as social structure. Social structure are the structures that determine the lives we lead. They include cultures, they include values, but they also include, if you're a Marxist, class inequality. And if you happen to be a policy analyst, they also include government policies, tax policies, and so forth. Agency is the actions of individuals. And sociologists argue that agents are you and I, human beings, but we act through interpretation. It's the way we interpret the world around us that shapes what we do. So if I could just turn again to my slide where it says judgmental dopes, that's a very famous phrase. It's a phrase used by Harold Garfinkel in a critique of Talcott Parsons from the 70s. Garfinkel, who became an ethnomethodologist, argued that Parsonian sociology was overstructuralist. It made human beings judgmental dopes. We didn't really have a life of our own because everything we did was created by social structure. To put it very bluntly, I as an Indian don't really have an identity as Nidhi. Everything I do is shaped by my social values as an Indian, including, my upbringing and my tacit values and whatever else is, if you wish, programmed within my head. And the point of saying that agency is about interpretation is to remind us that even in this moment of some pessimism, politics is actually within control. And the notion of mutual aid in that sense is a political notion. It's a notion that's interpreted, but is seeking also to respond to inequalities these people see in the world around them. So let me then briefly define mutual aid. On the left, you'll see three indications of Google Trends. These are all ones I made using the same search term. In Italian, the search term I use is mutuo soccorso. I have to thank Giuseppe for that because I actually emailed him and he was kind enough to tell me that would be the appropriate analog in Italian. You'll notice in all of them, from the beginning of the pandemic, the level of interest dramatically increased. So if you look at the very top one, you'll see this is for the United States. From February, the interest in the notion of mutual aid rose, and then it peaked in June, which was also the time that New York City started to emerge out of the pandemic, which was deeply, deeply destructive and traumatic for the city. Similar trends you can see in other places. So it could be argued that the peaks of interest also match the worst moments of the pandemic. This is a very limited indicator, but it does show that there is now considerable public interest in different parts of the world in the notion of mutual aid. Well, what is mutual aid? On the left-hand side and across this set of slides, you'll see that there are actually different ways that mutual aid is understood. These are media coverages. This is all from the media coverage of mutual aid. Let me briefly show you what you're looking at. On the extreme right, in the middle, you see an article from the New Yorker, which is a magazine based in New York City. Below it, you have an indication from Vice magazine, which is a website that has some interest in technology. And going to the left and going up, you will see cutouts from the New York Times, and then a tweet from a very prominent left-wing, or if you wish, left liberal politician in New York City called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or as people like to name her, AOC. You'll excuse me for a moment. I saw a chat comment. I'm just going to very briefly. Okay, thank you. I'm glad you find the topic interesting, Ajibola. So I'm going to very briefly go through these slides and go through these images to give you a sense of how mutual aid is understood. And then I'm going to go to the next slide and give you sort of a characterization of what this kind of a view of mutual aid tells us. So you'll notice the article from the New Yorker doesn't define mutual aid. It says what mutual aid can do during a pandemic. Quite literally, mutual aid is that, if you wish, the agent. If you read that sentence in a grammatical sense, mutual aid is actually doing something. It's acting. But keep in mind, mutual aid is not a human being. It's not even a thing. It's a series of actions and practices. So it begs the question, how does Gio Talentino, the writer of that article, define mutual aid? And I can tell you, if you read that article, it doesn't. If you look underneath this article, what is mutual aid and how can it help with the coronavirus? Gives you a clear idea. It says communities across the country are organizing to provide relief directly to people the government has failed. So if you wish there, mutual aid is about communities replacing the state or the government and trying to provide relief. Now, if you look to the left of that, why mutual aid? Social solidarity, not charity. You'll notice this one is from Can Europe Make It? And underneath it, it says Peter Kropotkin's most famous work, Advancing a Belief in the Depth of Our Connection to Each Other, is titled Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution. So if you notice the distinction between the one on the left and the one on the right, it's a distinction, classic distinction between Europe and the United States. The one on the left is about social solidarity. The one on the right is about charity. So when the one on the left says social solidarity, not charity, the one on the right, quite frankly, is actually saying charity, not social solidarity. Communities across the country are organizing to provide relief directly to people the government has failed. Now, I'm going to open up, if you wish, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's tweet for you by actually going to it in a moment. So if you'll just hang on, I'll expand on that a minute. Now, here are some cutouts from the New York Times. I don't want to be hard on the New York Times. The New York Times is a very respectable newspaper, but it is a newspaper with its own political position. And I think it's not unfair to say that the way it's describing mutual aid in these three clips that I've shown you on the slide repeatedly bring out the themes of youthful idealism and solidarity, but have no interest in discussing class divides, racial inequality, and the impact of neoliberal policies. So for instance, even the title, Feeling Powerless About Coronavirus, Join a Mutual Aid Network, you know, it's a little laughable, forgive me for putting it that way, to think that, you know, powerlessness is stopped by literally something as simple as finding a mutual aid network and joining it virtually. Because the article also goes on to say that the best way to deal with the quarantine is to be virtually close to a community. If nothing else, it isn't really the historical meaning of mutual aid, as I'll explain in a moment. If you look at the one on the right at the bottom, how college students are helping each other survive, there's no discussion in that article on the extraordinary fees college students pay in the United States, the level of debt they go into, and whether universities should be charging them those level of fees. Instead, the article is basically saying you might be poor, but you can help each other by sharing your food, to put it very, very simply. Well, what exactly then is mutual aid? Here is if you look at the bottom left, this is from a book on anarchism, and I've actually highlighted what mutual aid is. This is a definition from anarchist theory. Mutual aid is a highly politicized phenomenon which links the pleasure and joy of non-hierarchical relationships with the structural critique of capitalism and the state. So there are two elements to it. The latter is perhaps obvious. It's aiming at critiquing the way capitalism functions at the moment. But its effort to critique capitalism is through a non-hierarchical approach. A non-hierarchical approach here means an approach where you do not take for granted a work hierarchy. You do not assume that people are in fixed work roles where they can demand work from others. For instance, a manager can demand work from a worker. A subordinate has to respond and reply back to a superior. Instead, it's meant to be a relationship of mutuality. And this mutuality, if you wish, occurs in two broad ways. One, you avoid all hierarchy. That is to say, you say we're all equal. We are not going to divide work at all. And we're going to somehow do this work together. Or you rotate roles. That is to say, you divide work, someone gives the orders, but the next day that person is replaced with someone else who gives the orders and so forth. This way, each person has an opportunity to be in a position of authority, but is also therefore accountable to those they are in a position of authority towards. Historically, mutual aid signified an anarchist resistance to an atomized competitive market. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the French anarchist, argued that workers should control capital. Peter Kropotkin argued that local community ties could replace the market. So from those two themes, you can understand that mutual aid is an effort to civilize capitalism, to somehow have capitalism be more accountable to local communities, and to have this kind of accountability replace the tendencies of capitalism to encourage individualism and hyper-competition. In a managerial sense, if you are interested in ideas to do with organization studies, it signifies something very unusual, a non-hierarchical alternative to work bureaucracy. In any business school, and I've taught in many, you'll quickly learn that we have to divide work, and that the people who divide the work and keep performance accountable are typically the ones who are trained to be managers. In short, the business school trains people to give orders to others on how to divide work. But from a mutual aid perspective, you're actually saying there has to be another way to divide work. And that way is typically described as prefigurational politics. That's a very big word, prefigurational politics. It simply means everyone gets an opportunity to learn, to practice a position of authority. Imagine, for instance, you're in an NGO in a small village somewhere in Western Africa. Prefigurational politics would say in that village, every person within that NGO gets an opportunity to learn to be a boss, to be a manager, and to give orders to others, so that they all learn how to actually learn how to be accountable in a situation of power. There's a danger when you talk about mutual aid of defining it very strictly, and that, of course, is often the case in anarchist circles. If you define it very strictly, then you rapidly find there's very little that actually qualifies as genuine mutual aid. There's also a danger of defining it too broadly. The more broadly you define it, you lose the capacity to actually distinguish it sensibly from other terms that it resembles. Let me give you some examples. So here's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's tweet. This is what she tweeted. You may want to look at it a little closely because it's actually in some ways a very good example of how politics, including left-wing politics, functions right now in the United States. On the other hand, if you're not interested in the United States, you may not wish to look at this at all. And may I just say, if you're not interested in the United States, that's actually not unreasonable at all. I don't wish to give you the impression somehow that just because I happen to work in the United States, that it is necessarily a country of great interest. It need not be. Now, if you look at this slide, she actually quotes Kropotkin. But what does she quote of Kropotkin? We must cooperate to survive. Kropotkin did not just talk about cooperating to survive. Kropotkin actually said by cooperating to survive, you can replace the capitalist market. But that does, obviously Ocasio-Cortez isn't going to mention it. The reason she's not going to mention it is obvious if you look through the whole slide. There's not one discussion in that slide of the left, of socialism and of capitalism. The emphasis is on solidarity, on bringing people together. So if you wish, Ocasio-Cortez has strategically come up with an expansive, rather vague understanding of mutual aid to ensure greater involvement, while also ensuring that fewer people will be, shall we say, terrified, alienated, embarrassed, or concerned by the left-wing possibilities of mutual aid. Keep in mind, the United States is a country where even today, the notion of socialism makes some people incredibly scared, a matter which I find personally really laughable. So the emphasis is on engagement. The concern is strictly on facts. AOC is an admirable and skillful politician. I do greatly admire her. So I don't wish to lampoon this slide, but the question does remain, what does mutual aid actually mean in terms of its content? And what do people do within it? And politically, what does it signify? So I want to illustrate this through some examples. And in each of these examples, I want to show you the difficulties as well as the possibilities of tracking mutual aid. All of this is early research, and I do wish to emphasize that again. I'm not able to give you a presentation today that is a presentation of empirical information as much as of conceptual information. So this is the first of them. This is Hyderabad, which is a city in southern India. It's a software and services hub. It's a city where I grew up. It's also a city with a significant Muslim population that is an underclass. During the pandemic last year, the Indian state imposed a severe lockdown of 2 months. And more recently, it again imposed a severe lockdown of 6 weeks. The lockdown has now been lifted. Both times, the lockdown led to tremendous hardship to poor communities within the city and an exodus of rural labor. It also emphasized the divides within the city. For instance, within the Muslim population, a significant group of them that were poor were being neglected. Because they did not really receive the attention from the state that they deserved. And local philanthropy was not able to notice them because that philanthropy was geared towards other communities of other religions and other class groups. One of the groups I've studied here is the Hyderabad Urban Lab. I've actually pasted their website. And if you type in that phrase, Hyderabad Urban Lab online, you should actually be able to find the website I'm looking at. And if you look through them, they're a very good example of mutual aid. They first of all function with a very modest hierarchy. Second, they are very much concerned with creating solidarity. And third, they're gearing that solidarity towards a gentle but persistent critique of the way markets and the state function within Hyderabad, right? So this is, if you wish, a very proactive, specific example of mutual aid in Hyderabad. Here's another example from the same city. This is the Helping Hand Foundation, which is a Muslim network of solidarity and support. Their website describes them as seeking voluntary cooperation and care. And at least one description of them that I found online says they have actively lived and are deeply embedded in everyday life. On the right-hand side, you'll see an image on the top of people who are members, if you wish, of the Hyderabad Helping Hand Foundation, as well as beneficiaries of it. I don't think I need to be very emphatic on this, but it should be evident to you that there is a striking level of coherence, ethically speaking, in their identity and in the manner in which they function. These are also people who are within a shared locality. That part of Hyderabad is ethnically stratified. And so if you are in the Helping Hand Foundation, you're focused on a very specific part of Hyderabad, which is where you do your work. The remaining images on the right-hand side give you an indication of some of the work they do. This includes ambulances, as well as morgue help. Under the regulations in India at the moment, if you die of the coronavirus, you have to be cremated. You cannot be buried. And your relatives cannot see you before you are cremated. So the Helping Hand Foundation finds a way to collect the body and to allow the relatives to somehow see it in COVID protected settings before the body is taken to be cremated. This is where I live. If you actually are looking at this image right now, you'll see on the middle of the slide, you'll see it says Astoria houses. And if you actually go towards the left of it, you'll see there's an island opposite that image. And that island is Roosevelt Island, and I actually live on it for what it is worth. I wanted to point this out because I think it's always healthy, especially in virtual communication, to get a sense of where each one of us is, because it tends to kind of ground us. So Astoria houses marks a region of Queens, which is a borough, or if you wish, one of the 5 boroughs that define New York City. It's an area that is dominated by Greek Americans, but is increasingly also now populated by Bangladeshis, and has historically also had a West Indian as well as an African American population. So you could say it is ethnically quite diverse. It also has public housing. In fact, that mark, Astoria houses, is marking a public housing. If you look to slightly above it, you'll see it says 10 Hallett's Point. That also is public housing. Public housing is a phrase used in the United States for heavily subsidized housing that is given to poor groups by the state. It is less common today, but it was rather common in the 70s. And New York City has one of the largest public housing infrastructure in the United States. Most criticism of public housing is that it's neglected by the state. The people in it are essentially ignored. Those of you who know the French suburbs that are known in French as the banlieue will know of similar problems there that are similar to what happens in public housing in the United States. So the area has a high range in age. with demographics stretching from young people to the elderly and a very high range in income. Those in public housing are of very low income, but this is an area that today is rapidly gentrifying, and there are people who live here who are also quite wealthy. So this is the Astoria Mutual Aid Network. It functions in this area and provides help to the elderly. And its website, which you can actually open, immediately asks you if you need help or if you want to help. And that itself gives you an indication of how they function. You'll also notice it says we are nonpartisan, we are grassroots. So if you wish, the website is trying its best to tell you we are apolitical. We don't have an agenda, politically speaking, but we're eager to help. But if you say, I want to help, you'll be placed in touch with a group of people. And that group of people will organize to provide food to the elderly, to people in need, in public housing and outside, and they'll coordinate this through social media. You may meet a couple, you may not, but there is an opportunity there for some building of solidarity. So I do want to emphasize that though this website gives you the impression that they are focused on relief and charity, there's a possibility here of solidarity. If you look at the quote at the bottom, you go to one of the Irish bars on Broadway and it's a guy who shows up at 2 p.m. and stays till close. These are the people I'm really scared for, because a little love and attention might go a long way, but they're not inclined to ask for it. This is a quote from one of the founders of the Astoria Mutual Aid Network. And what she's saying is, we're trying very hard to help those who may feel so vulnerable, so disposed that they don't even demand to be helped. And I do want to emphasize that even in such a situation, there is a creation of solidarity, if nothing else, because you're bringing together people of very different class backgrounds. I now want to turn to Turin, a city I don't know well, but which I'm delighted to say at least some of you know extremely well. And I would like to hope there'll be some efforts to educate me when we have some time for discussion. One aspect of Torino that fascinates me is that it has one of the oldest links to mutual aid I can imagine. Far older, in fact, than Hyderabad or New York City. I don't know enough about it, but the notion of mutuo soccorso, I would argue, is probably very closely linked to Torinese identity, to the way the city had guilds and apprentices. In fact, even the way the city itself was evolved after the Piemontese monarchy collapsed and Italy was created as a nation state. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about it, but I would be very glad to be educated. On the right-hand side, you see an article by Adriana Luciano, which gives you some sense of the historical aspects of mutual aid in Torino. At the bottom in the middle, you'll see a photograph that I took maybe 10 days back by the Po River when I was jogging. It says La Nuova Cooperativa. This is an image from a car which, as I took the photograph, the person in the car was actually cleaning the grass next to Ponte Vittorio Emanuele. And I believe that that is a cooperative that is given this task by the government and runs itself as a cooperative, given its title. Most of the cooperatives in Torino originated through worker-led efforts to control labor. And as a result, a lot of them are linked to historical trades and have a kind of a professional cohesion. They are not politically very active from what I can gather. They're studiously neutral, but they seem to be a political force. That is to say, any government that comes into Turin's as a city government works with these worker-led unions and worker-led cooperatives. On the right-hand side, you'll find some description of some of these groups. One of them is Torino Solidale, which describes itself as a project of social solidarity funded by local foundations and the city government, as well as by banks. At the height of the pandemic last year, it actually built a housing shelter within 9 days. It was able to provide for the homeless and offered nurseries, kindergarten, and elderly care. I want to then conclude, and I believe I've gone slightly over my time, so I'll try my best to be a little quick in the conclusion. And I haven't opened the chat box in case there has been a question or a remark made. I want to conclude by actually turning to two things I haven't really spoken about closely. One is capitalism, one is management. This is a painting of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon by Gustave Courbet. In capitalism, historically, mutual aid generated two responses from those critical of capitalism. Those who were very critical of mutual aid would say it's really a palliative, that it basically is just a way to withstand what is inevitable, which is the collapse of the capitalist system. State protection is going to keep declining. Welfare systems will not work very well. Entitlement claims will keep declining. We're looking at a time when the state will rapidly empty its pockets and corporations will become wealthier. So if you wish, from a left-wing perspective, a radical left-wing perspective, all that is actually quite good, because this kind of a crisis gradually will lead to a response that will help us create a social order that is different from the existing capitalist social order. And if you believe that, mutual aid is a problem because it's actually making the crisis bearable. It's delaying the inevitable. That's, I admit, a very radical and perhaps narrow perspective. On the other hand, you can also find on the left, on the right, and in a variety of locations, a great interest increasingly in sort of reforming the market in ways of creating alternatives to how markets currently function. For this reason, I would argue it really matters how we understand mutual aid. And it really matters how mutual aid groups see themselves and how they actually prefigure or train their members for questions of solidarity, and whether they actually look at alternatives to the market. So to give you an example, the Hyderabad Urban Lab to me is exciting. The Helping Hand Foundation, less so. The Helping Hand Foundation seems to me rather like a conventional nonprofit organization. I'm not convinced it is actually mutual aid. They call themselves that, but I'm not sure of it. Similarly, if I look at New York City and the Astoria Mutual Aid Network, I'm not convinced it's a political force. I do think it is simply a local stopgap measure to respond to problems in state funding. And I suspect if the situation improves, it'll rapidly decline in significance. But I do want to point out that however you look at mutual aid from a perspective of studying capitalist politics, there is a historical echo here, and the echo is to do with the First International. In the dismal history of the left, and I say dismal history as someone who sees himself as being on the left, one of the first splits on the left in Europe happened when the First International had a big argument between Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin. Marx argued that the goal of the left should be to seize the state, while Bakunin argued that the goal of the left should be to reject the state and create, if you wish, a stateless world. Leaving aside which one of them was right and which one of them should have behaved better in their discussions, the question still remains. Can mutual aid actually constitute a credible force against powerful capitalist actors? And can it actually transform capitalism itself? Another way to see this is to return to what I began with. And you'll note that I began by using words that were rather emotive. I used words like pessimism, hope, despair. But I would argue that if we look at agency, we typically look at agency as something we do on the world. And if we look at agency as acting on the world, it is a notion of hope. Every one of you who's been at some point within a pandemic forced to be in solitary confinement, I think each one of you, like myself, understand what it means to act on the world. Think of that moment when you could go out again for a walk, when you could jog, when you could take your dog out, when you could say hello to a friend, wave at someone from a window. Each one of them would have offered you some notion of hope. Human actions constantly remind us that we are hopeful human beings. Structuralism recognizes human action, however, as swallowed in a sprawl of constraints. Acting on the world in that sense seems insufficient. The world acts on its own, never mind us. And that tends to be a notion of despair. I recently read a book by Robin Marasco on critical theory, and in that she argued that a notion of despair can actually be critically productive. It can generate hope. So if you wish, she's arguing that being to despair isn't always so bad. challenging previous interpretations of Adorno, Habermas, and other Frankfurt School theorists. Marasco is, if you wish, arguing that we should snatch despair from the jaws of pessimism. What do I mean by that? Typically, we think of despair as being pessimistic. We think of pessimism as giving up on the world. Marasco is saying, no, despair is part of a dialectic. By despairing, we find hope, because despair reminds us of what we have to lose. It reminds us to fight further. So in that sense, despair is not pessimism at all. Despair names something different. It is a crisis in movement and direction, but not a response to loss. So I would argue at the moment, despair is a good way to look at the world around us. And it's a way that is rather dynamic. It is something that is rather objective as well. It's a passionate encounter between what we see around us, seeking a productive outcome from it. One area for that kind of a productive outcome is management itself. And I've deliberately chosen an image on the right that shows you a person in power about to step off into the abyss, aided, of course, by his followers. If we consider a dialectic between hope and despair, somehow we also hope that the schools are one place where, peculiarly enough, this dialectic will have some sort of a traction. At the moment, there's an extraordinary interest in professional circles in mutual aid. Maybe it's because they recognize that conventional hierarchies have reached the end. Maybe it's also because they think there are new ways to keep the capitalist system going through market forces that achieve social goals, call it solidaristic economies or social innovation. It might be that, the interest is more sincere than we realize, because ultimately mutual aid, like any other collectivity, also has to find ways to manage itself, to raise money, to keep itself going, to handle the pressures on its solidarity. There is here again an echo, a historical echo, just like Bakunin and Marx's historical quarrel still typifies what mutual aid could constitute for the promise of capitalist politics. There's still an aspect here, and that aspect goes directly, if you wish, to the history of Torino, to Robert Michel's, the famous notion that Michel's had of the iron law of oligarchy, where he reminded us that every movement ultimately will gravitate towards a stable hierarchy that entrenches people in power. And you will find that oligarchy that's created is very hard to change, regardless of what that oligarchy stands for. And you can find that today in the discussion, for instance, on mutual aid, where a lot of people say that mutual aid must not become a nonprofit organization, it must not NGOize. And ultimately the question remains, how do you create a kind of politics of solidarity that also allows you to organize credibly to ensure your goals are accomplished? So I then stop with this question: can mutual aid enable hope despite despair? Can it create a form of organization that constitutes a credible alternative to hierarchical organizational structures? And can it ultimately show us a different and better way of managing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this amazing presentation. So, I mean, I have very much thoughts and many questions, but I would like to ask other participants if somebody has any thoughts, comments, questions before I start.
I have a question, if I may.
Thank you, Sankari. Go ahead.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for the really interesting talk. It actually feeds into one of my research areas at the moment, so I was very thrilled with it. It's given me a lot of reference points. But I just wanted to ask you particularly, I've been reading articles which say that I don't want to say post-pandemic because we're not post-pandemic yet, but in the COVID era, there have been companies, international organizations, and the powers that be, like Facebook and Amazon and whatnot, that have shared their data. My understanding of mutual aid is that it's an exchange of resources and services for benefit.
And that doesn't mean that institutions, it's just done by individuals that are trying to organize. It's also done by big institutions where, they come, private institutions that come to the service of global communities or their own domestic communities. And they share their data sets, or they could be sharing IP regarding vaccinations or whatever it is, right? I just wanted to really get your opinion on why the big institutions, the ones that wield power, in your opinion, might engage in mutual aid. Because I've read opinions about why, maybe it's a byproduct of their research and development and they can't really monetize it. So maybe they'll just share their IP, or they'll share their data that they've collected because it doesn't really affect them financially. And then obviously there's pressure from global actors and global communities to say, look, this is a matter of life and death. You need to share your information because this isn't like a normal situation. You have to come to the aid. We're in crisis. In public interest, in view of public interest concerns. So I just wanted to find out from you, in terms of like incentivization and global organizations and the big powers, why would they engage in mutual aid? Are they engaging in mutual aid? Should they engage in mutual aid? Really, what is their role in it, and how can they kind of be pulled into the dialogue?
Sankari, thank you very much for that question. It's a really good question. And after I've responded, I'd love to actually get some details on some of these corporations you're mentioning. Imagine for a moment we see mutual aid as a very, very large, broad term, and we can define it in a variety of ways. Now, imagine for a moment that we see it as an effort to control social ties, right? If we were to see it as an effort to control social ties, what corporations increasingly are doing is socializing market ties. Here, let me give you some examples that might make this a little clearer. Facebook functions by socializing market ties, right? I mean, what it basically does is it creates an interface where you can create friendships with people you know and do not know, but that interface is then also offering demographics that enable advertising and targeted advertisement, as well as harvesting personal information for corporations to use, right? So your social ties are being marketized and commodified, right? Same with Twitter. Same with other forms of social media. Now imagine that you are in a corporation, you are trying to sell your products, and historically the way you sold it was through advertising, through big retailers and so on. You will find now that many will advise these corporations that you have to start understanding how social ties function, and you have to find ways to infiltrate these social ties with your product. So what Sankari you're mentioning is partly about this kind of infiltration. And you could call that mutual aid if you want, but I find the phrase mutual aid is a little confusing in that context. I really see it much more as a marketization of social ties. But the flip side of this is that you also have a situation where increasingly certain kinds of information are becoming harder to control and are often being held on to by large social media companies, which are being pressured to share it in different ways. Sankari you mentioned the vaccination, for instance. Certainly it's true. We could use social media companies to control and share information on who's been vaccinated, and I don't believe they do that. But the other aspect of this is that if you're organizing in mutual aid, a peculiar aspect of it is that you are reliant deeply on social media. For instance, the groups I've studied, they often coordinate their meetings using Twitter, Messenger on Facebook, Telegram, and so on and so forth. They're using different social media apps. And what they all tell me is the same thing. They say that these apps are not designed for organizing for social solidarity. They're actually designed for a very different purpose. And after a while, we find they're very hard to use. In short, they're really reminding us that we increasingly have to consider crowdsourced social media tools that can enable different ways in which people can organize mutual aid. And if we were to do that, that actually would provide a kind of a credible pressure point for corporations to start considering types of information that they'd be more comfortable sharing. For instance, it could be information to do with resources they have. It could be even information to do with patents they have that could reduce the spread of the pandemic. Thank you, Sankari.
Thank you very much.
That was a wonderful question. Thanks, Sankari. Does anybody else wants to chip in? If not, I can ask. I'll wait for 5 more seconds. Okay, Georgina, go on, please.
Yeah, let me first lower the hand, otherwise I will forget. Why are you pessimistic when you look at these organizations in terms of a long-term? You sounded pessimistic, at least, in terms of the longer-term prospects on whether they could be the beginning of solidarity, a different way of doing things.
I can think of many reasons, but I'm very grateful you've asked that question, Georgina. It's a very important question, and you're absolutely right. I did sound pessimistic. Let me see if I can give you 3 reasons, because there are too many. The first is these efforts are scattered. If you look around the globe right now, the mutual aid efforts are quite scattered. Certainly for Hyderabad, as well as for New York City, I have some basis for the pessimism. For Torino, I don't know it well, so I'm not going to speak about Torino at all. But in Hyderabad, the efforts are quite scattered, and the state is still flailing. It's not being very successful. Same in New York City. There's been a huge outpouring of funds for the mutual aid network, but at the end of it all, mutual aid network hasn't been able to work successfully with existing state agencies, and it hasn't been able to also build alliances that are across class boundaries. So one reason is that. The second is the emptiness of the phrase. Until we have a greater clarity on what it means, mutual aid could simply mean anything from a nonprofit organization that is registered to an opportunistic short-term response. And so empirically speaking, it is very hard for us to track it enough to find a basis to not be pessimistic, or to put it another way, to take it more seriously. That is, it may not be pessimistic, but it may be hard for us to think we can expect a lot from it. The third reason is, if you wish, linked to your country and mine. I'm assuming you're from Brazil, forgive me, that's a presumption on my part. But if you look at the history of the PT, the Workers' Party in Brazil, one could argue the PT in the 70s through the 80s was actually a very good example of a kind of a social movement that encouraged mutual aid. Of course, by the time that Fernando Henrique gave up power and Lula came in, the famous ad that was placed in the papers to tell them that Lula would not destroy the country and they didn't need to worry that the real would fall and so forth. You see the PT dramatically changing its tactics and becoming now an institutionalized political party, moving away from its roots, moving away from the alliances it had with even the MST and so on. So one could argue that mutual aid functions in a constellation of extra political forces, and that those extra political forces are ultimately significant in the way mutual aid is constituted. So even right now, I'm sure in Pará, in Manaus, of course in Rio, in a variety of places, there are mutual aid groups helping each other. Brazilians, like human beings everywhere, are eager to help each other and are kind. To the extent whether that'll actually translate politically into something credible is unclear. The same holds here, the same holds in India, but there is an importance to this. If we believe that the world we live in today, the capitalist world, is facing some sort of enduring crisis, I believe that, and I'm happy to defend that view, but I'm not going to argue that everyone believes it. But if we were to believe that, then the question really that comes up is, how would mutual aid constitute a political response that could somehow reform capitalism? And there, I think the pessimism is extraordinarily high. In fact, Sankari's point is worth noting. The corporations are the ones really jumping into sort of an appropriation of mutual aid. I wouldn't go as far as to say they're actually giving resources for free, but I do believe that they're quite attentive to the forms of solidarity that mutual aid relies on. And they are attentive to the fact that these are this is free labor. This is free labor where people are helping each other and are not paid for it. And if you're a clever, canny marketer, you will see this as an extra social force that can help you that can help you sell products further.
So can I just follow up on that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
You say that they do view it as a form of free labor. And one of the articles I read actually did say that, where where you formalize kind of, I would call it mutual aid efforts of people kind of mobilizing to help each other, and then they register as NGOs, and they sometimes even the legislation reflects the kind of efforts that they're trying to make, such as the markets in Palermo and various other efforts, where they say, okay, look, we'll identify certain spaces as public common spaces and that type of thing. But all that is an effort to kind of like create an urban decorum, which then makes it more attractive for investors and capitalists to come and invest in an area. So it's kind of like, you recruit people as free labor in order to kind of exert actually more capitalistic control over an area by formalizing it. So when you're now saying, when we're talking about mutual aid and you're saying that business schools are studying it and there's more emphasis on it, what is the point if it's, because we're looking at it from a perspective of reforming capitalism, but is it actually, what is that balance? How do we, I mean, what's the actual conclusion? I mean, in terms of, if we're taking an optimistic view, what does it actually do? How do we use it to create the effect that we actually want?
Yeah, very, very nice, Hankari. Thank you. I mean, rather a rich remark. The first part of what you said, if I heard you right, it's very, very pertinent that you remind us of how the efforts to sort of rejuvenate the urban commons in different parts of the world, including in Italy, as well as here in the United States and elsewhere, that these efforts to rejuvenate the urban commons are often really done to increase gentrification, increase tourism, and are part of a kind of a vision of the city, not as a place where people live, but rather as a place where you consume and where you essentially consume a particular version of the city. I mean, I'm again going to return to Brazil only because it's a very good example. If you think of Rio de Janeiro, just before the Olympics came to that city, the city government went through a massive beautification spree. They opened museums, they expanded the subway line, they created new lines. They took parts of the city that were filled with the poor and that were rather dangerous, and they found ways to hide it. And they also created what in Portuguese is called the pacification groups, which were groups that the police brought into these favelas, into these urban settlements, to kind of work with the local people and pacify them and make things a little better. In some of those initiatives, they even gave credit cards to the poor, finding a very ingenious approach where the poor could get credit cards that also functioned, if you wish, as a way to monetize their lives and bring them into the public realm, because the favelas are undocumented spaces. So one way to understand the urban commons is to say it's an effort to make the poor more legible and more controlled within the sphere of gentrification and within an imaginary of capitalist cities. But again, since you did mention optimism, and I take Georgina's point considerably, keep in mind that any effort of any kind will always be unpredictable. And it was during that effort in Rio that the effort to beautify Rio, that local people started to create alliances to protest hikes in transit fees, to protest the neoliberal policies of the PT, which ultimately led to Dilma's government having to step down. And so we can never really know what kind of political energies will be released through a kind of an initiative. And so even a notion of the urban commons that tries to gentrify can actually be quite unpredictable. So now, having said that, what that means in terms of business schools is this. On one hand, within business schools today, there is a certain level of discomfort and revulsion with the extremes of corporate capitalism. If you wish, this is an effort where a lot of people within business schools are aware that we have to recognize there's a severe environmental crisis, that inequality cannot be sustained past a certain level, and that corporations do have obligations to societies, and as a result, management academics do have an obligation as well to train management students to be more socially accountable. So I wouldn't go as far as to say this is a dominant view in business schools, but business schools today have changed considerably from the way they were in the 1980s. They are facing some pressure from within their constituencies and outside to be socially more accountable. At the same time, mutual aid groups globally have one very severe problem, which is that they often become very offended and disgusted with management ideas, which they associate with large capitalist groups. And so they don't realize that however they constitute themselves, they'll have to work out a way to function. And that way to function will have to be one that's sustainable in terms of people investing in it with their energies, and a way to function that allows them to also balance their books. And they can find any approach to take, but certainly management textbooks and management schools do teach ways to function as an organization. And so mutual aid groups often require some training and understanding of organizational theory, and may, in fact, not want to have it at all. So on both sides, I would say there is a certain affinity to reach out and learn from each other. Now, the optimistic reading of this is this could lead to mutual aid groups that become more savvy, that are able to survive longer, and lead to business schools that gradually become more radicalized. The pessimistic view is that this may simply not be enough.
We have one more question in chat, which
Thank you.
Typed to me privately, but I will read it now so he doesn't do double work. So he asks, is there a link between the mutual aid model and the cooperative model?
Does a person mention any location, or is that just the entire question?
I think he will speak.
That's fine. That's a very good question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anya. They originate in the same place. For instance, Proudhon, who I mentioned, his notion of cooperatives was of social solidarity. And early anarchists, including Kropotkin and Proudhon, were very committed to cooperatives being a key basis to organize society. So mutual aid you could see as a form of cooperativism. They diverge in the following. Within the anarchist movement, Proudhonites were generally more supportive of the state and eager to work with the state. They saw their role as a supportive role to the state. And the people who followed Bakunin, I'm sorry I'm smiling, but I'll tell you why in a moment, but the people who followed Bakunin believed you had to overthrow the state. And so this led at times to rather painful and unfortunate disagreements. To give you one example, which is from some research I've already published, cigar factories in Cuba in the 1880s were actually dominated by anarchist workers. And so these cigar factories had unions that were anarchist unions, and they had two factions. You had cigar factory unions that were Proudhonites, and your cigar factory unions that were Bakunites. The Proudhonites believed they should work with the Cuban government. The Bakunites believed they should overthrow the Cuban government. And they would spend a lot of their time fighting with each other. That's why I smiled. Because ultimately, whether you argue one position or the other, there is a great danger of losing sight of the very basic challenge of actually organizing social solidarity at a local level, to create, if you wish, to make the commons tangible. Because there is a misconception that the state does not exist, and there's also a misconception that the state does everything. But the commons emerges often in both the gaps left by the state, as well as in the areas that the state literally cannot regulate at all. And so it's worth remembering that social solidarity ultimately is what the state builds on. And I would argue that the Bakunites lost sight of this, and the Proudhonites perhaps also lost sight of it to some extent. So in terms of the question then, cooperatives, in a short response, cooperatives are one effort at mutual aid, but most people who believe in mutual aid would say cooperatives are insufficient because they tend to take the easy way out and find an accommodation with state-supported capitalism. So for instance, you can look at Mondragon, which is a huge cooperative network historically based in the Basque region of Spain. It works very closely with the Basque government and has historically had healthy ties with Basque nationalism, not unhealthy ones, but healthy ties. It isn't a bad organization in any sense of the word, but it would be hard-pressed for us to describe it today as a mutual aid organization. It's more correctly described as a large corporation that evolved from cooperatives.
Thank you. I have one question, if nobody wants to add anything anymore. Okay, so sorry, I have a question and a comment. So I will start with a comment where I see, I want to add up on the optimist spectrum of this discussion. So because my knowledge of mutual aid relies mostly on David Spade, who uses the grassroots idea of mutual aid, which excludes charity. But now hearing how it's actually used in places it's practiced, it's very useful to know that area too. So I recently read about, particularly in regards to COVID-19, I remember reading about Heidi Larson, an anthropologist working with the anti-vaccination movement, where she was mentioning that what's causing the sort of spike in anti-vaccination, anti-lockdown behavior wasn't really any particular thing, but the lack of trust in institutions, which, according to her, is completely reasonable. So what I sort of tied it with was the lack of social ties and the erosion of social or the community and neighborhood ties, which has been noticeable in neoliberal capitalism, particularly in poor and marginalized communities who used to have this very strong neighborhood ties, but now they're slowly eroding again. So if you ask me on the optimist side, I would say that the mutual aid sort of helps rebuild these ties and helps rebuild trust in the community and actually works on the field. So I don't know, what would you think about that? And my question would be, since many authors like to point out that for mutual aid ties, it's important to note that you don't only have these very new initiatives occurring, but you also have social actors, groups, movements who have been active throughout the years re-emerge in regards to their importance in the social in society. So that's it for me now. That question and comment, yeah.
Anya, could you tell me what is the question in the second comment you made about the actors who've been persistent?
Yeah. Sorry. Because in your discussion in regards to Torino and Astoria, I noticed that there was a tradition of community engagement that's now re-emerging. But I was wondering, is there a tradition in Hyderabad that's now reoccurring, or is this a completely new initiative? Thank you for reminding me.
Anya, that's a really wonderful set of remarks. Thank you. I really appreciate you reminding me of David Spade, because Spade is a good example of a classical, rather precise definition of mutual aid. And it is a definition I'm very sympathetic to. It's also part of what I quoted in that slide. I think we do have to ask ourselves if there's a danger in defining it too narrowly. And that, I think, is a political question. It could be argued that by leaving it a little broad, we can actually steer charitable interventions that see themselves as apolitical and non-threatening into directions that are genuinely radical, or if you wish, even the best one can find in that circumstance. This is one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to criticize Ocasio-Cortez greatly, because I think that for a variety of reasons, what she's doing is actually quite radical in this very conservative setting. However, what you mentioned about Larson reminds me of the following, which is what I really want to do with this research as I move it ahead is to characterize mutual aid as contextually embedded and to describe how the definition of it shifts in each of these locations. And I'm glad you made me remember this because you mentioned Heidi Larson. And I like her work very much, and I completely agree with her assertion on the anti-vaxxers. And I'm very, very glad you reminded us of this. So yes, you could argue that mutual aid is a way of repairing social solidarity. But neoliberal policies functioned differently and were characterized differently in different places. So for instance, in Italy, there have been state cutbacks. In fact, many Italian commentators argued that one of the reasons initially that the response to the pandemic was so poor was that the Italian health system had been better in the past than it was now because it now had less money. But what little I know, again, those cutbacks have been different in different parts of Italy. So a lot would then depend on understanding what were the costs to social solidarity in particular locations. That is to say, how did a neoliberal set of policies work within a setting, and what kinds of effects did it have and on whom? And that would then help us track how mutual aid could repair, if you wish, some of that solidarity. Otherwise, it's very, very hard to get traction on it. And this is not my effort to say mutual aid is not sufficient, but it's rather to point out we have to be a little careful in how we characterize it. Because if we don't characterize it with some precision, it'll be very hard to know how it functions with a neoliberal policy and how it actually repairs that solidarity. Now, the other aspect that you raised is crucial. If you look at a place like Torino, it has a very, very long history of social solidarity. What little I understand of it, I would characterize it as the following. First, there is solidarity led by the state. Historically, the state governments in Piemonte as well as in Torino worked very closely with a set of quite influential foundations, which in turn are funded by very wealthy banks. One of them is the Intesa San Paolo, which is an extremely influential foundation and of course is linked to the bank of that name. So there is an alliance, if you wish, that is like a ruling, rather stable elite group that has dominated Piemonte politics. So it could be then argued that that kind of a dominant elite group also provides a space for particular kinds of social solidarity. We could imagine, for instance, that classic, very old artisan groups that were able to organize themselves would have some level of protection from the state. They'd have some level of subsidy. They would be also encouraged to take up some contracts and do some work. What is unclear to me is about the class and racial divides. For instance, where do undocumented migrants fit into that? Where do Italians who have been naturalized over the last 25, 30 years fit into it? What are there regional tensions, for instance, between Italians who've been naturalized and came in originally from, let's say, Albania, as opposed to Italians who were naturalized and came in, let's say, from parts of Africa or parts of Bangladesh, right? That is unclear to me. What is their own relationship to this ruling elite? What is their own relationship to, if you wish, the established civil society groups that already exist? The reason I mention this is in terms of what you said, there are consistent agents and they have always been there. And I think that makes a crucial difference to the resilience of a city. I would even go as far as to argue that it is possible that Torino withstood some of the excesses of the pandemic because of this consistency of social solidarity from their past. But how that shapes inequalities within the region, between citizens, between groups, that's not clear to me. And I think that's essential to understand because it goes back to the first comment you made. Neoliberal policies affect groups in different ways. And so there will be groups that are weakened further because they're more disposable, while there are other groups that will have other resources that they can rely on. Thank you, Anya. That was a wonderful question and comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And if nobody has, do we have more questions? Because we are at the end of our time for the discussion, but I would like to, yeah. If yes, we have an announcement and a question. So an announcement by Christina and a question by Ajibola, but related to further YSI activities. So I would give the word to Christina now.
Great, thank you, Anya. Thank you so much, Professor Srinivas, for an excellent presentation. Really, really interesting. And I think we're all looking forward to following your research further. And so thank you so much for that. Thank you everyone for all your questions and for, great.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No worries.
I just wanted to briefly say as well that I just finished a book, and I'm waiting for the book to, for the proofs to arrive. And so I'll be very, very happy to discuss it later in another venture. And I'm very grateful for any interest you have in my research. Those of you who found my website, you'll find information on the book in it eventually. And I'll make sure I share it with Giuseppe as well in the future. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
No worries, perfect. I think we're already setting up for another event and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you, Professor. And thank you, Anya, for your excellent moderation and organization. And we'll make a little note for as soon as that book comes out, we'll organize another event and looking forward to that. And thank you everyone for all the questions and the engaging discussion. I think it was just really interesting to hear all the different perspectives. And I think this is exactly what YSI and IUC are about, promoting this kind of dialogue and ensuring that we are thinking ahead of the kind of world that we want to create and live in. And so thank you everyone for participating. A few announcements with regards to future webinars. And so next week we'll have on the 13th of July, Professor Jan Toporowski talking about central banks in a time of pestilence. And that'll be moderated by Sankri Reddy. And so looking forward to that. That'll be part of the YSI IUC webinar series. And then on the 14th of July, part of the Financing the Future webinar series, we'll have Dr. Georgina Gomez with Michael Kosh moderating. And Dr. Gomez will be talking about monetary plurality in local, regional, and global economies. And so we're looking forward to it. So I think we have a number of really exciting webinars and conversations coming up. So please join us for those. I think those are all the announcements from my side, and wishing you all a very good afternoon. Thank you for being patient with us and for sharing your time. We really appreciate it. And if there are any other questions, then we can answer those. But if there's nothing else, then please enjoy the day.
Thank you, Christina. So in regards to the other announcement, Atibola, who is here, and I think he will speak now, he's from a cooperative working group at the YSI, and he saw the mutual aid event, and he was wondering if it can be, in addition to being in our working group, can be expanded into a webinar series of its own in the cooperative group. But I asked him to, talk or contact more, but yeah. we are networking already, so this is a very good case in point.
I think it's a wonderful idea, Anya. I certainly hope it'll happen. I'll be very happy to support it in any way I can.
Thank you. We will contact you, and everybody, thank you for this wonderful event. And it was, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you did as well. So with that, I hope you enjoy your day, and we are here for all other questions and concerns. So thank you, Professor Srinivas, once again.